A virgin mountain man stood in the snow beside his brother's grave. When he looked at the grieving widow and said, "By spring you'll birth our son," the town froze. Every breath held captive in the biting December air. Whispers spread like wildfire through the mourners. A vow made in front of God and everyone watching. A reclusive trapper, a man they called Virgin Boone, claiming his brother's wife and unborn child, with the earth still loose on the coffin. But what no one knew, not the preacher, not the gossiping women, not even the mountain man himself, was that the child was already gone. His promise, spoken with the weight of mountain stone, was already a lie. Now the whole town mocks their marriage. They call him a fool, blinded by duty. They call her a liar, a temptress who trapped two brothers. But when they take in a starving native boy found half frozen in the snow, everything changes. Whose child is he? Why does the preacher want him sent away? And what secret promise is this mountain man truly keeping? As the snows melt and the rivers rise, a scandal is about to become a reckoning, and mercy is about to be tested harder than iron in the forge. The December wind cuts sharp across Silvervale, carrying the bite of mountain snow and the weight of tragedy. Telegraph wires hummed their grim message down from the logging camp, each click spelling out words no one wanted to hear. Caleb Boone, caught in the avalanche, gone before help could reach him. The message found Violet Boone in her schoolhouse. The chalk dust from tomorrow's lesson still hung in the air when Sheriff Wilson appeared in the doorway, his hat clutched to his chest. One look at his face told her everything. The chalk slipped from her fingers, shattering on the wooden floor like the pieces of her world. Word spread through Silvervale faster than the winter wind. Up in the mountains where the disaster struck, snow continued to fall. Among the silent loggers stood Noah Boone, his brother's death settling on his broad shoulders like the weight of the mountains themselves. They called him Virgin Boone, a name some spoke with respect, others with quiet amusement. He kept to himself in his line shack high above the town, more comfortable with the silence of the pines and the chatter of men. Now, as the men looked to him, he said nothing. He simply wrapped his brother's body in a blanket and lifted it onto his horse. The journey down was treacherous. Snow had filled in the trails and darkness fell fast. Noah's thoughts turned to Violet, alone in town, waiting. He remembered the day Caleb had brought her home, his brother's face glowing with pride. Now that light was gone, snuffed out like a candle in a storm. And he remembered the promise he'd made Caleb just last summer, sworn over a shared bottle of whiskey. "If anything happens to me, brother," Caleb had said, his voice serious for once, "watch over what's mine, especially the boy. Promise me you'll stand as his father." Noah had promised. He just never figured he'd have to keep it so soon. As Noah descended, whispers were already circulating. Mrs. Prudence Hodge, the preacher's wife, heard them first in the general store. "Poor Violet," Martha Jenkins was saying, her voice barely a whisper, "and in her condition, too." Prudence's hand paused over the dry goods. "Condition." "Well," Martha leaned closer, "Sarah Cooper says she's seen signs. You know how Violet's been looking peaked these past few weeks?" The news reached Reverend Josiah Hodge as he prepared his evening sermon. "Some say she's with child," his wife told him. Hodge set his pen down carefully, his face tightening. "Then we must pray this tragedy doesn't lead to greater scandal." Dawn broke cold and gray. The whole town gathered in the churchyard. Frost glittered on bare branches, and breath rose in clouds. Noah stood alone, his tall frame straight despite exhaustion. Violet appeared at the church gate, supported by Mrs. Hodge. Her face was pale but composed, her black dress stark against the snow. As Noah carried his brother's coffin toward the waiting grave, their eyes met briefly. Something passed between them, grief, understanding, and a shadow of the vow that now bound them. Reverend Hodge's voice carried across the churchyard with practiced authority. "We are gathered here to commit our brother Caleb Boone to his eternal rest." Winds swept down from the peaks, rattling bare branches. The service drew to a close as the first new snowflakes began to fall. "Ashes to ashes, dust to—" A small gasp interrupted his words. Violet's knees buckled, and she began to crumple toward the snow. Noah moved with surprising quickness for such a large man, catching her before she could fall. "The child," Violet whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Caleb's child. I'm carrying his child. Tears froze on her cheeks as she looked up at the faces surrounding her. I have no one left, no kin at all. The mourners shifted uncomfortably. Reverend Hodge's hands tightened on his Bible. The whispers were confirmed, and now the proper order of things hung precariously in the balance. It was then that Noah's deep voice broke the tense silence. Though his words trembled slightly, they carried the weight of mountain stone. Then by spring, you'll birth our son, and I'll stand for both of you, as my brother would have wanted. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. Noah Boone, the reclusive trapper, had just publicly claimed his brother's widow and unborn child. Reverend Hodge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Perhaps we should conclude the service, he said, his voice tight. He approached Noah as the mourners dispersed. Brother Boone, a word if you please. Inside the empty church, the preacher chose his words carefully. Your intention is honorable, but to protect Violet's reputation and the child's, a quick marriage would be best. Tonight, if possible. Noah's hands clenched at his sides. Tonight? The longer we wait, the more tongues will wag, the preacher pressed. Noah stared at the cross hanging behind the pulpit, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a single sharp nod. I'll fetch her at sunset. The news spread like wildfire. As dusk approached, Mrs. Hodge helped Violet change from her widow's black into a simple blue dress. The young woman moved like someone in a dream, too numb to protest what was happening. When Noah arrived, she took his arm mechanically. The church was lit only by lamplight. The ceremony was brief, the words echoing in the near empty space. When asked for her response, Violet whispered, I will. So softly it was barely heard. Noah's voice, by contrast, was clear and firm as he placed his mother's worn ring on her finger. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, Reverend Hodge proclaimed, closing his Bible with a decisive snap. Outside, Noah helped Violet into his waiting wagon, wrapping her carefully in thick blankets. As they drove slowly through the darkened streets, lights glowed in windows where curious faces watched their passage. The mountains loomed above them, silent witnesses to this strange day of death and marriage. They followed the steep trail toward the cabin Caleb had built. The wind grew fiercer as they climbed, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles. Violet huddled deeper into the quilts, one hand pressed against her middle. Noah noticed her discomfort and urged the horses faster. The cabin appeared ahead, a dark shape against the whirling snow. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light welcomed them home. Just as they reached it, Violet's soft gasp of pain made Noah turn sharply. Her face had gone gray, both hands now clutching her stomach. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms. She felt terrifyingly light as he carried her through the door, her body trembling with more than cold. He laid her gently on the bed, Caleb's bed, their bed now, and rushed to light the fire. I'll fetch the doctor, he said, his voice tight with a new fear. Please, Violet whispered, curling into herself. Hurry. The ride back to town was a blur of wind and darkness. Noah pushed his horse harder than was wise on the icy trail. When he returned with Dr. Matthews, they found Violet half conscious, her face wet with tears and sweat. The doctor's examination was swift and gentle, his experienced hands confirming what he had feared. When he straightened, his eyes held deep sympathy. I'm sorry, Noah, he said quietly. The child, the shock and grief were too much. There's nothing to be done. Violet's cry of anguish pierced the cabin's shadows. Noah stood frozen by the door, his huge frame seeming to shrink with helplessness. The vow he had made, the promise that had sealed their fate, had turned to dust. He was a husband to a woman who was not his wife. He was a father to a child that would never be born. Then Violet reached for him, and he moved without thought to gather her in his arms. She wept into his chest, her slight body shaking with sobs. Noah held her carefully as if she might shatter, while his own tears fell silently into her hair. His vow was a lie. Her hope was gone, and the mountain was about to make them pay for it. 2 days later, the whispers in Silvervale turned to open mockery. Inside Dawson's saloon, the regulars huddled around the stove. Virgin Boone, Tom Dawson said, wiping a glass. Reckon that name won't stick no more, though his cradle's empty all the same. Coarse laughter followed his words. Outside the mercantile, Mrs. Peterson spoke in hushed tones to Mrs. Miller. Mark my words, that school teacher knew exactly what she was doing. And no baby after all. Mighty convenient, if you ask me. The scorn followed them to church that Sunday. Violet insisted they go, her voice soft but determined. I won't hide. The wagon ride was silent. As they approached the church, the crowd on the steps parted, conversations dying mid-word. Inside, the stairs followed them to a pew near the back. Reverend Hodges' sermon was on Jesus and the woman at the well, emphasizing divine mercy. But his gaze kept flicking toward them, and his words felt more like an accusation than a comfort. Afterward, the whispers were louder. Shameful business, someone muttered. Poor Caleb barely cold in his grave. They were halfway up the mountain trail when Violet finally spoke. Do you regret it? She asked, her voice barely audible. Those words you spoke at the funeral. Noah's hands tightened on the reins. For a long moment, only the horse's breathing filled the winter air. I meant them, he said simply. But they both knew the promise was hollow now. That evening, after the chores were done, Violet lit the lamp on the small table. She opened Caleb's Bible, its leather binding worn smooth. In the beginning, she read softly, God created the heaven and the earth. The ancient words filled the cabin's shadows. Noah sat by the hearth cleaning his rifle, the familiar click of metal a steady counterpoint to the fire's crackling. Neither spoke of the empty cradle in the corner or the town's cruel whispers. They let the scripture's cadence wash over them, a temporary peace. But peace was a fragile thing on this mountain. As the days turned into weeks, Noah knew they couldn't stay. The town's judgment was a poison that seeped into everything. He made a decision. We're leaving, he announced one morning, his voice leaving no room for argument. My line shack, up high. No one will bother us there. Violet didn't protest. There was nothing left for her in the valley. Dawn crept over the mountains as Noah loaded supplies into the wooden sled. Sacks of flour, strips of jerky, fresh candles. Violet stood in the doorway, wrapped in a worn wool shawl Noah had given her. It was my mother's, he'd said, pressing the soft fabric into her hands. He lifted her onto the sled as easily as if she were a child, and they began their ascent. Noah walked beside the horse, his rifle in hand. The sled runners whispered through the snow, marking their passage away from the life they had known. By midday, they stopped by a frozen creek. They sat on a fallen log, eating cold biscuits in silence. The winter sun hung pale in the sky, offering no warmth. Around them, the mountain held its breath, locked in winter's embrace. As the sun began its slide westward, the trail grew more treacherous. Twilight was fading when they finally caught sight of the line shack. It was small but solid, built to withstand mountain winters. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. Other trappers must have used it, Noah said, a line of worry creasing his brow. He didn't like surprises. He helped Violet down, his hands gentle on her waist. While he unloaded the sled, he motioned for her to stay put. He approached the cabin cautiously, his rifle ready. The door creaked open under his hand. The inside was empty, but a fire was banked in the hearth, radiating a faint warmth. Someone had been here, and recently. Noah found tracks leading away from the back of the cabin, heading higher into the peaks. They were shod hoof prints, not a wild animal. Someone had watched them approach and left in a hurry. But they weren't alone in the high country. Something was out there in the snow, and it wasn't an animal. The feeling of being watched lingered for days. Noah established a steady rhythm, rising before dawn to check his trap lines, his axe splitting wood in the cold air. Violet created her own routine inside, sweeping the floor, mending their clothes, learning to make every scrap of food last. The isolation was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crack of ice in the trees. One afternoon, as Noah brought in another load of wood, Violet noticed him glancing at the Bible on the shelf. Would you like to learn? She asked softly. His cheeks flushed slightly. Never had much schooling, he admitted. Caleb was the reader. She opened the book to the Psalms, and he sat beside her, his large finger moving slowly beneath each word as she helped him sound them out. The Lord is my shepherd, he read haltingly. I shall not want. His quiet determination touched her. This strong man who could survive alone in the wilderness. accepting instruction with the eagerness of a child. Their routine was shattered 3 days later by a blizzard that howled like a living thing. For 2 long nights they were trapped by the hearth, feeding the fire. The world outside dissolved into a fury of white. During a lull in the wind, Violet found herself speaking of fears she'd never voiced aloud. "What if I can't have children?" she whispered, staring into the flames. "The baby I lost? What if that was my only chance?" Noah was silent for a long moment. "The Lord gives and takes," he said finally. "But you promised me a son by spring," she reminded him. "How can you keep that vow?" His answer surprised her. "There's more than one way to build a family," he said quietly. "My mother used to say that love matters more than blood." After the blizzard passed, they emerged to a world transformed, deep and pristine. That night, Violet stood at the window, unable to sleep. A wolf's howl echoed from the distant ridges. The wild sound comforted her. Like them, the wolf was surviving. She glanced at Noah's sleeping form. Something was growing between them, quiet and steady as the snow. A companionship built on respect and shared faith. Perhaps this forced marriage could become something real. The morning dawned bitter cold. Noah rose early to check his traps along the frozen creek. The sun had barely crested the ridge when something caught his eye. Tracks, not deer or rabbit. Small footprints, clearly human, and barefoot. He knelt to examine them. They wandered erratically, suggesting exhaustion. They were fresh. He followed the trail, his hunter's instincts on high alert. It led him to a stand of blue spruce. Curled up against a trunk was a small native boy, no more than 7 or 8. His lips were blue, his thin clothing crusted with ice. Noah approached slowly. "Easy there, little one." He shrugged off his heavy wool coat, wrapping it around the boy's shoulders. The child felt terrifyingly light as Noah lifted him into his arms. He hurried back to the cabin, worry spurring him on. Violet gasped at the sight. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, clearing a space by the hearth. They worked together with urgent efficiency, piling quilts around the boy, warming broth, checking his fingers and toes for frostbite. Around midday, the boy's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes full of confusion and fear. He tried to sit up, speaking rapid words in a language they didn't understand. "Shh," Violet soothed. "You're safe now." The boy's hand went to his chest, clutching something beneath his worn shirt. With trembling fingers, he pulled out a small charm on a leather cord. A bird carved from dark wood, its wings spread in flight. He pointed to it, then to himself, speaking a few words in what Noah recognized as Ute. Violet smiled warmly. "Little Crow," she said, mimicking a bird's flight with her hand. "Is that your name?" The boy nodded slowly. "Little Crow it is, then," Noah said, and the name settled into the cabin. Over the next few days, they nursed their young guest back to health. Gradually, as his strength returned, his natural resilience began to show. He followed Noah outside, helping to carry kindling. He learned English words with surprising speed. Horse, tree, fire, bird. One evening, Noah found himself carving again, shaping small animals from pine wood. A deer, a rabbit, a wolf. Little Crow's face lit up as Noah handed them to him. The toys worked a magic that words could not. Soon his laughter began to ring through the cabin, a sound that transformed the small space. He seemed to be healing. But the nights were different. The boy would wake up screaming, his hands clenched, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the cold he'd survived. He was running from a memory, not just the snow. One evening, as they sat sharing a meal of rabbit stew, Violet watched Little Crow carefully spooning broth into his mouth. She glanced at Noah. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "What you said that day at the funeral, about having a son by spring. Maybe this is what God meant. He already sent us one." A small smile tugged at Noah's beard. "Reckon you might be right." Little Crow looked up at them and pointed to his wooden animals arranged beside his bowl. "My family," he said in careful English. The word filled the cabin like warmth from the hearth, binding the three of them together. But the peace was fragile. The feeling of being watched returned. Twice, Noah found fresh tracks near the cabin, the same shod hoof prints he'd seen when they first arrived. Whoever was out there was getting bolder. One night, as a new storm brewed in the west, Little Crow woke with a scream that was sharper, more terrified than ever before. He sat bolt upright, pointing toward the window. "He's here!" the boy whispered, his body trembling. "Who's here?" Noah asked, grabbing his rifle from its rack. Little Crow shook his head, unable to speak, and just pointed again at the dark, swirling snow outside the window. He was screaming a single word in his own tongue. A name. The same name of the man who'd threatened Caleb just before the avalanche. The first whispers of spring came in early March. Small rivulets of meltwater began threading through the snow. Inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth grew. Violet taught Little Crow his letters. Noah taught him how to use a slingshot, aiming at pine cones. The rhythm of their days had become as natural as breathing, but their supplies were running low. "I have to go to town," Noah announced. "It'll take 2 days, maybe 3. Violet felt a knot of worry. She'd grown used to Noah's steady presence. Little Crow watched with anxious eyes, clutching his bird charm. "We'll be fine," Violet assured them both. The journey was hard. In town, Noah ignored the curious stares and loaded his sled. The storekeeper's wife tried to engage him in gossip. "Heard you and the missus adopted a little Indian boy," she said, her eyes glinting. "Reverend Hodge was asking about it. Seemed mighty concerned." A cold feeling washed over Noah. Why would the preacher be concerned about a boy living miles up in the mountains? He finished his business quickly and headed back. By the time the cabin came into view, exhaustion had settled deep in his bones. But there was light in the window, smoke rising from the chimney. The sight filled him with a joy he'd never known. Violet met him at the door, Little Crow peering from behind her skirts. The cabin's warmth wrapped around him like an embrace. Later that night, Violet sat beside Noah. "I don't feel alone anymore," she said softly. He looked at her, saw the firelight soften the grief that had lined her face. "You made this place home," he replied, his voice rough with shy honesty. She smiled and took his hand. In that moment, something shifted between them. The space that had separated their bedrolls on the floor seemed to shrink. Duty had become companionship. Companionship was becoming something more. They decided it was time to make things right. "We should speak about Little Crow," Violet said, "about making him truly ours before the law." Noah agreed. Violet carefully composed a letter to the Indian agent in Gunnison, asking for guidance on adoption. Their peaceful world shattered 2 weeks later. The late March morning dawned clear and crisp. Violet was kneading dough, while Little Crow counted spoonfuls of flour. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Noah's head snap up. 2 riders appeared through the trees. Noah recognized them immediately. Agent Thomas Halpern from the Indian office. And beside him, the stern figure of Reverend Josiah Hodge. "Stay inside," Noah said quietly. He stepped out onto the porch. "Mr. Boone," the agent said, his voice clipped with authority, "we've come on official business." Inside, Little Crow pressed close to Violet's skirts, fear shadowing his face again. Agent Halpern set a leather portfolio on the table. "I'll be direct. We've received reports about an Indian child being kept here without proper authorization. He must be returned to the reservation immediately." "No!" the word burst from Violet. "Please, I wrote letters asking about adoption." "I have those letters," Halpern said, "but the law is quite clear. The child must remain with his people." "His people left him to freeze," Noah said quietly. "We found him half dead." "And there's another matter," Reverend Hodge interrupted, his voice sharp. "This marriage itself was contracted under false pretenses, a pregnancy that conveniently disappeared." Violet flinched as if struck. Noah took a step forward. "Mind your words, Reverend." "You're living in sin," the preacher declared. "The marriage was based on a lie. The child is here illegally." Little Crow suddenly spoke up in his careful English. "Please, let me stay with my mom and papa." Halpern looked away, but his duty hardened his features. "You have 3 days to comply," he said firmly. "I'll return on Friday to escort the boy. If you resist, I'll bring the marshal." They moved toward the door. As they rode away, the agent glanced back, not at the boy, but at the stand of old-growth timber behind the cabin. And Noah realized this was never about a child. It was about a claim. After they left, Violet collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down her face. Noah went to Caleb's old sea chest, the one he hadn't touched since his brother's death. He pried it open. Inside, beneath folded clothes, was a leather-bound journal. He handed it to Violet. Caleb was the reader, he said. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Caleb's familiar scrawl filled the pages. He wrote of logging deals, of timber claims, and he wrote about Reverend Hodge. The preacher had loaned Caleb money, a lot of money, using the timber claim as collateral. The debt was due in the spring. If Caleb defaulted, the claim and all the valuable timber on it would go to the preacher. Then Violet gasped. She read a passage aloud. Caleb wrote about a secret deal he'd made with a Ute elder to log a section of their land. A deal the tribe didn't approve of. The elder had given him a token as a sign of their agreement, to be shown to the elder's son if anything went wrong. The token was a small carving, a crow with its wings spread. "It's Little Crow," Violet whispered. "He's the elder's son. He was there. He saw the deal." Noah's blood ran cold. He looked at the last entry in the journal. It was dated the day before the avalanche. "Hodge is pushing for his money. He knows about the Ute deal. He said if I can't pay, he'll find another way to collect. He's a dangerous man. I fear he won't let a promise to God get in his way." The journal explained everything. The avalanche wasn't an accident, and Little Crow wasn't lost. He was a witness. The fire crackled in the hearth. Neither Noah nor Violet had slept. Rain drummed steadily on the roof as a spring storm gathered strength. "What can we do?" Violet whispered. "They'll bring the marshal. They'll force us." A small gasp from the shadows made them turn. Little Crow stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with understanding and guilt. He had heard everything. "I make trouble," he said in his careful English. "Better I go." Before they could move, he darted to the door. The latch clicked and he vanished into the darkness and the rain. "No!" Violet cried. Noah was already grabbing lanterns. They plunged into the storm, calling his name. Thunder crashed and lightning split the sky. Noah found small footprints leading toward the forest. "He's headed up slope." They followed the tracks until they reached the tree line, where the prints grew fainter. "We have to split up," Noah said, passing Violet a lantern. "You circle toward the creek. I'll check the old hunting trails. If you find him, fire the shotgun 3 times." Noah saddled his stallion, Thunder. The horse's hooves churned mud as they set out. Rain lashed his face. He thought of the first time he'd found Little Crow, half frozen, the trust that had slowly grown in the boy's eyes, the way he'd started calling them Mama and Papa. "I won't lose you, son," Noah whispered fiercely. "Not to the law, not to this storm." Thunder crackled overhead. In the silence that followed, Noah heard it. A cry, thin and frightened, coming from the direction of the river. The spring rains had swollen the river to a torrent. He turned Thunder toward the sound, crashing through the underbrush. Another flash of lightning revealed the river ahead, its waters dark and furious. And there, on a fallen log jutting out over the rushing water, he saw Little Crow's small form. But he wasn't alone. A figure stood on the bank, a heavy branch in his hand. Even in the stormy darkness, Noah recognized the stooped shoulders and the dark coat. It was Reverend Hodge. He wasn't there to rescue the boy. He was there to finish what he'd started on the mountain. Noah saw the tracks in the mud, 2 sets, one small and barefoot, the other the distinctive boot print of Reverend Josiah Hodge. The river roared, a churning beast of mud and melted snow. Little Crow clung to the slick log, his small body shaking. On the bank, Reverend Hodge took a step closer, his face a mask of grim determination in the flashes of lightning. "The Lord's justice is at hand, boy," the preacher shouted over the storm. "You should have stayed on the reservation." "Leave him be, Hodge." Noah's voice boomed as he slid from his horse. The preacher spun around, his eyes wide with shock and fury. "Boone, you should have minded your own affairs." "He is my affair," Noah said, his hands clenched into fists. "He's my son." Hodge let out a harsh laugh. "He's a witness, just like his father, and just like his father, he needs to be silenced." The confession hung in the air, more chilling than the icy rain. So it was true. The avalanche was no accident. Hodge had killed Caleb. Without another word, Noah plunged into the flood. The shock of the freezing water stole his breath, the current grabbing him instantly. He fought against it, his powerful arms cutting through the water as he angled toward the log. "Stay still, son," he called. "I'm coming." On the bank, the preacher watched, a terrible smile on his face. He knew Noah couldn't fight him and the river at the same time. He hefted the heavy branch, waiting for his moment. Noah reached the log, grabbing for the boy. "I've got you," he said through chattering teeth. He wrapped one arm around Little Crow's waist, and the boy's arms locked around his neck. "Scared, Papa?" he whispered. "The Lord's watching over us," Noah assured him. A massive crash upstream made Noah's head snap around. A wall of debris, logs, branches, pieces of the old bridge, was heading straight for them. There was no time. Noah pushed off from the log with all his remaining strength, aiming for the bank. The current caught them, spinning them in its grip. He kicked desperately, trying to keep their heads above water. On the shore, Hodge saw his chance. As Noah struggled, the preacher waded into the shallows, the branch raised like a club. He was going to finish them both. He swung the branch down with a grunt. Noah saw it coming and twisted in the water, taking the crushing blow on his shoulder instead of his head. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot down his arm. He cried out, his grip on Little Crow faltering. The boy screamed. The debris wall was almost upon them. But just as Hodge raised the branch for a final, deadly strike, another sound cut through the storm. A rifle shot. It echoed off the canyon walls, sharp and clear. The branch flew from Hodge's hand as the bullet splintered the wood. The preacher staggered back, clutching his stinging fingers, his face a picture of disbelief. On the opposite bank, two figures sat on horseback, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. Agent Halpern, his rifle still smoking in his hands, and beside him, Violet, her shotgun leveled and ready. "It's over, Josiah," Halpern's voice cut through the rain. He'd followed the preacher from town, his suspicions aroused by Hodge's strange obsession with the Boone family. He had heard everything. With Hodge distracted, Noah made a last, desperate lunge for an overhanging branch near the bank. His fingers closed around the rough bark. The current tried to tear them away, but Noah held fast, his muscles screaming. Slowly, he pulled them to shore, collapsing on the muddy bank, with Little Crow still clutched to his chest. He was fading, the cold and the pain overwhelming him. His last sight was Violet running toward them, her face a blur of tears and rain, as Agent Halpern dragged the sputtering, defeated preacher from the water. With a snarl, the preacher raised a rock to strike the boy. But before he could, a rifle shot cracked through the storm, and it wasn't Noah who pulled the trigger. The mountain spring came slowly that year, like healing to a deep wound. Snow lingered in shadowed hollows, while purple pasque flowers pushed through melting drifts. In the cabin above Silvervale, Noah Boone fought his own battle. The doctor had warned of lung fever, and for 2 weeks, Violet and Little Crow kept vigil, nursing him back from the edge. Down in the valley, the truth had spread like a river in flood. Reverend Hodge was in the sheriff's custody, awaiting the circuit judge. His confession, witnessed by Agent Halpern, had exposed his greed and his murderous heart. He'd killed Caleb to seize his timber claim. He'd tried to remove Little Crow to silence the last witness. The town that had whispered and judged now fell silent with shame. One crisp morning, hoofbeats approached the cabin. It was Agent Halpern. He dismounted, holding a thick envelope. "Mrs. Boone," he said, handing it to Violet, "these are the official adoption papers. Signed and sealed. Little Crow is legally your son." He then turned to Noah, who sat in a chair on the porch, still weak but getting stronger. "And this," he said, handing over another document, "is the deed to that timber claim. With Hodge's assets frozen, the bank has signed it over to Caleb's next of kin. It's yours." Violet's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Halpern tipped his hat. "I was just enforcing the law. The right law this time." Easter Sunday dawned clear and bright. The whole town turned out, filling the churchyard. They weren't there for a regular service. They were there for a wedding. Noah stood at the front, his Sunday shirt crisp against his broad shoulders. Little Crow stood beside him as his witness, wearing new boots he couldn't stop admiring. When Violet walked toward them in her simple blue dress, a hush fell over the crowd. This time there were no whispers, only smiles. A visiting preacher performed the ceremony. When he pronounced them man and wife, the cheers from the townspeople echoed off the mountains. Afterward, the town held a feast. Women who had once turned away now crowded around Violet, offering recipes. Men who had mocked Virgin Boone now clapped Noah on the shoulder, talking of timber prices. Little Crow darted between groups, proudly introducing himself as Little Crow Boone. Noah caught Violet's eye and smiled, remembering that cold December day when they had stood as strangers in the same churchyard. Weeks later, as May brought 1,000 shades of green to the valley, Violet knelt in her garden. The morning sun felt warm on her face, but something else stirred within her, a familiar flutter that made her catch her breath. She pressed a hand to her belly, hardly daring to believe. She called Noah inside. He saw the look on her face and his heart stopped. "I've been feeling something," she began. She took his rough hand and placed it against her belly. "Noah," she whispered, "I believe I'm with child." He slid from his chair to his knees, his head bowing until it rested against her. His shoulders shook as he repeated the words he'd spoken that bitter day, but now they rang with a joy that was almost painful. "By spring, you'll birth our son." Violet ran her fingers through his hair. His vow had been a promise of faith against all hope. But God's plan was a miracle of love. They found Little Crow beside the cedar cradle Noah had rebuilt. He'd saved every charred piece, sanding and fitting them back together. The flames had left beautiful dark patterns in the wood, like scripture written in darkness and light. "Little Crow," Noah said, his voice thick with emotion. "God's answered another prayer. You're going to have a new brother or sister come winter." The boy's eyes grew wide. He reached out and touched Violet's middle. "The baby's in there?" he asked, "like a seed in the garden." "That's right," Noah said, "growing stronger every day." From the valley below, the church bell began to toll. They knelt together beside the cradle as the last echoes faded. The cradle, scarred by fire but stronger than before, stood waiting, proof that faith, like love, could rebuild what was broken and make it whole. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Thanks for listening.